Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and glad to be back on my show. It's been a while. I've been traveling, as everyone knows, and doing some very interesting conferences, and also going to check out a site for a possible Camelot trip. I do take tours around. So we went to Delphi, or Delphi, however you want to say it, which was quite fascinating, what they've done to that. And I've written an article on my website. So if you're interested in hearing more about my trip or anything else, I've got tons of stuff being released on my website right now, including Eddie Page and his dialogues with me via email. So we are planning to do another show in the near future. But in the meanwhile, I've been asking him a lot of questions over email. So you can go there onto Eddie's blog. So he's a guest blogger on Project Camelot. We actually have a number of them. The really active ones right now are Eddie Page and unwanted publicity guy, Paul Collin, who also wrote a front page article recently on the whole visit to see Putin and some other details that might interest some people. So at any rate, tonight or today, we have Michael Fitzhugh Bell, and I'm very happy to have him back on the show. Actually, I think we've done one or maybe even two interviews, not sure, can't quite remember, but at any rate, you can go to my YouTube channel, my main YouTube channel, and just put his first or last name in, and you will be able to find the other interviews. So want to bring him here on the show. He is a targeted individual, has written an excellent book on human targeting and surveillance. And we have a lot to discuss, new developments that he has been monitoring and checking out and perhaps even experiencing. So Michael, you're on the screen front and center here. Say hello to everyone.
Yes, hello. I'm Michael Fitzhugh Bell. It's nice to be back on Camelot, Project Camelot with you, Carrie.
Excellent. Yes. And so I know that you had a number of things that you wanted to cover. First of all, let me ask you to give like a website and sort of pertinent information just for people to look at in the meanwhile, and also anything about yourself on, you know, in terms of your background. Maybe you could do a summation, even though we've covered some of this before.
Okay. Well, I've written two books. My first book was The Invisible Crime, Illegal Microchip Implants and Microwave Technology and Their Use Against Humanity. And I have a brand new second book, The Invisible Crime Part 2, A Targeted Individual, Synthetic Telepathy, and Global Criminal Biomedical Human Experimentation. And I have two websites, www.invisiblecrime.com and www.michaelfbell.com. My books are available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and wherever fine books are sold. And just for the people who don't know anything about me, I'll give you a brief background on my experience as a targeted individual. I was originally a screenwriter in Hollywood, California, and an aspiring screenwriter, just getting big meetings and interviews with some of the big literary agencies, and some of the studios were interested in some of my spec scripts. And I was just getting those meetings and just getting my foot in the door in Hollywood when I was at one night in one of my apartments in Hollywood. I was drugged and abducted. I remember the perpetrators were wearing frightening masks, and at one point lying on a stainless steel table with a bright light shining on me, and surgeons wearing surgical masks standing over me. And I woke up thinking that it was the next morning, but to my horror, I discovered that it was actually 8 days later. And I noticed that my body was riddled with dozens of tiny, corresponding and symmetrical covert cosmetic surgery incision scars. I couldn't understand what had happened to me, and I consulted with several private investigators and a former CIA agent that informed me that it sounded like I'd become what is known as a targeted individual, and that I'd possibly been implanted with advanced nanotechnology biomedical devices. So I was very anxious to have whatever was put in me taken out and prove my case. And it's not easy to get medical evidence. You can't just go to a doctor and ask for something to be removed. It needs to be approved. It needs to be okayed by a doctor. Sadly, you can't just demand the evidence that you need. So, at least in this country. So I traveled around the world collecting medical evidence in the form of MRIs, ultrasounds, X-rays, all with verified and validated real doctors' reports, all clearly showing foreign objects directly beneath these covert surgical incision scars. And the private investigators and the former CIA agent all told me that I was likely part of a massive field test of an illegal clinical trial of human experimentation using classified technologies. And people wonder what part do targeted individuals have in this program that I've written about in 2 of my books. It's really, to describe what it is, it's really the most advanced weapon system ever created by mankind. It's a weapon in every sense of the word, and it involves every aspect of science, neuroscience, medicine, psychology, physics, mathematics, as well as all war tactics, techniques, and methods. It's basically the sum of all human knowledge. This program that I'm a part of is widely recognized as an unacknowledged special access program believed to be part of the military-industrial complex, which is composed of the military, Black Ops, the military, the Department of Defense, the NSA, the Department of Justice, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as DARPA, and a human experimentation program that causes extreme physical terror as well as physical torture for the victims, in this case me. And this kind of illegal human experimentation is considered a war crime and is the highest ranking type of capital crime of its kind, punishable if convicted by the death penalty. And also in my research, a very interesting, and people may be shocked with these numbers, but it has been estimated. And when I say my information, all of my information from my books and all of my interviews my information is based on information that I've gathered from private investigators, a former CIA agent, and corresponding with and interviewing thousands of targeted individuals from around the world, and my own personal research and experience. It's been estimated in that research that as many as a third to as much as 50% of Americans have already been implanted with non-therapeutic, non-consensual RFID biomedical implant technology without their knowledge, permission, or consent. And really what it is technology is way ahead of the law. The law has a lot of catching up to do. Really.
Yeah, well, that's a great overview. So where are things at for you now, Michael?
Well, I have to say that since I've written my books and done my interviews, my targeting has only increased, which kind of tells me that perhaps what I'm doing is a threat to the criminals, to the perpetrator group, to the cabal. Really, in my case, most people don't know why they were chosen to be targeted individuals, and they may never know, and they may just think they have a reason, but most don't have anyone that comes forward and tells them exactly why they've been chosen. But for me personally, people have asked me why, and for a long time I really wasn't sure, but I have to look back and say that it's probably it probably stems from an accident that I was responsible for when I was 19 years old. And the person that was traveling with me in the vehicle that I was driving was permanently handicapped and severely crippled as a result of that accident. And that person happens to be part of one of the most powerful, most influential, and wealthiest families in the world, with extremely strong political and government ties. And this family is also widely recognized to be part of one of the 13 Illuminati families. So it makes sense that would be the reason for my being targeting. I can't believe that would happen and that my targeting was for another reason. It doesn't seem possible for me. But also another thing, I'm constantly I'm under 24/7 constant surveillance and monitoring using classified technologies certainly in my new book, I described that there are three different groups of perpetrators, but I'll get to those in a second. I wanted to say something about the exposure to the frequencies and the signals that I'm constantly being exposed to. Because of my constant and continuous exposure to the frequencies and signals that are generated through the classified technologies that I'm saturated in 24/7, my natural metabolism has been artificially sped up to the point where I have to consume an enormous daily calorie intake just to maintain a normal, healthy weight. I'm 56 years old, and the average normal calorie intake for a regular person my age, would be roughly between 2,500 and 3,000 calories per day to maintain a healthy, normal weight. Now, I'm burning between 6,000 and 10,000 calories every day, even at rest. That is the same amount of calories that a mountaineer climbing Mount Everest would require on summit day. And if I don't consume enough calories, my weight drops off very quickly. And some people would say, well, that's terrific, you can eat whatever you want, but it's not that. I mean, yes, I could, but it's different when you want to eat some amount, and then when you're forced to eat a huge amount that just gets burned up every day, even at rest. And if I do any activities, I have to even increase my calorie intake even more. Also, another part that another really interesting thing that I discovered that I don't believe I shared last time with you is that when I lived in California, that's where this first happened to me when I was in Hollywood. But I lived in a couple of different apartments in California, and several for 5 years or more. And when I went back, one of them was in Hollywood and one of them was in Palm Springs, California. And interestingly enough, when I was back in the area, when I went back to visit two of the apartments that I lived in for 5 years or more, the person that had moved in to those apartments, the people that moved into those apartments after me, became targeted individuals. And I'd never heard of, I don't know if that just happened with me or if that's common with other targeted individuals, but both of the people that moved into my old apartment soon after moving in began complaining about all of the same harassment and stalking and noise complaints that I had that were identical to mine. When I went back to my apartment in Hollywood, my manager, when I drove by one time, I was in the area and I wanted to swing by and see my old building. And when I went by, my manager happened to be there out in front, and I stopped and said hello. And I asked him how the new person was who was in my apartment. And he said, it's a funny thing. the person that moved in is complaining about all the same things that you were when you lived here. And so and then in my apartment in Palm Springs, I went and actually knocked on the door of my old apartment just to say hi to this person that I was in the area. And this person, I could tell, was, I'd never met this person before, but by the way they were acting and by the things that they were telling me, complaining about noise and harassment by the neighbors. And I knew very quickly that this person had become a targeted individual as well. So that was interesting that in two different apartments, the people that moved in after became targeted individuals themselves.
Right. Well, perhaps they're just widening the net. It is interesting. You know, I think a lot of people are targeted at this point, and I do think that it's increasing. So it may also be happening in terms of what you call like territories. So they may have widened this. You know, it's become a larger net, I think you might call it. Also because we're in the sort of roll up to 5G, and this is going to result in a lot of these kinds of things where more and more people are being targeted. And there's also an interesting gloves off approach by what I call the Illuminati and the cabal, the dark state, whatever you want to call it, the deep state, etc. So, you know, I think that there's a lot going on there. I don't necessarily think they were targeted because of who they are, so much as they may, you know, that area may be being canvassed, so to speak. And it makes sense because Palm Springs and Hollywood are both sort of centers of the entertainment community, if you know, are aware, and I assume you are. And those people are of special interest because obviously they're not only usually working in the entertainment industry, but they're also influential in the entertainment industry as a result of the work they do. So you know, I have to say that it actually doesn't surprise me all that much, but it is quite interesting.
Yeah, and also I think also it may be that once you live in a place as a targeted individual, oftentimes it's been explained to me by targeted individuals that are perhaps even they know even much more than I do, that they've explained it to me, is that even when you move into an apartment, before you move in, that apartment is often set up for you in terms of microphones or cameras or any of the classified technologies that they have that enables them to track, monitor, and view the targeted individual. All of those things are usually put in place either before the target even moves in, or if they're away, it's done at some point when they're away. But over time, that apartment or that residence will be completely set up. So if it's all set up and people in the neighborhood are already participating as perpetrators in partaking in the organized stalking or the harassment, if all those people are set in place around this apartment, there's been a huge amount of money invested into the surveillance of that apartment.
Yes,
so it makes sense. It makes sense for somebody who moves in that they already have everything set up. So it's the new person just walks into it unexpectedly. That's what I think happened to the people that moved into my apartments, but I don't know.
Right. You know, I'd still say it is again, in part because of what I'm talking about, this sort of targeting of a certain group, that financial group that moves into a certain area that has certain proclivities that are part of the entertainment community, et cetera, et cetera. There's reason. In other words, I don't think they would just keep it in place for no reason. I think, just because it's there, I think they have an agenda, and the agenda wraps up into individuals that you fall into that category. And so, yes, they targeted you out of a specific sort of event. Obviously, it appears, but I can tell you, I mean, having worked in the entertainment industry myself and having been targeted myself and know others that are, I can say it's highly likely that those whole areas are kind of blanketed. Certainly, to me, it's a no-brainer. Hollywood, West Hollywood, definitely will be targeted in various ways. So now you have been looking into various technology that's coming out. And I think you also did want to talk about 5G and how that might affect things. So do you want to talk a little bit about, I don't know, you sent me an article that also talks about various technology and so on.
Well, I mean, I know about some of the, I can talk about, the 5G technology, some people believe it's already, for people like targeted individuals, it may already be rolled out for them. For the general public, it's coming. And certainly, if the targeted individuals aren't already receiving that high end of frequency and delivery system of the 5G, it's certainly going to make it easier for the criminals, and certainly probably much harder on the targeted individuals. I'm sure about that.
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of updating people about where things are at now, are you saying you have another book out, or are you saying that, because you contacted me specifically about.
Right. Well, yes, I had a couple of things that I wanted to share that were new well, here's one thing that a lot of people don't really bring into consideration is that targeted individuals are the direct result of a corrupt government, for sure. And this crime, which I've written about, which is based in secrecy and deception, could not exist without the complicity and acquiescence of the United States government, the medical community, and law enforcement. And it's been suggested, and it's not difficult to perceive and understand, that corrupt judges and prosecutors can be bought and paid for to further the agenda of the criminal cabal. And it's widely recognized that one of the ways that people can become targeted individuals is that they've been wrongfully, illegally placed onto the terror watch list. So that was one thing I wanted to share. And
right.
And that's something that a lot of people don't consider. It's very easy. A FISA warrant can be issued against a person that allows for surveillance against foreign spies or persons of interest. And it's really, it's so easy. You could raise reasonable suspicion, quote unquote, reasonable suspicion, if you're involved with terrorism. Irrefutable evidence and concrete facts are not required. And you could post something on Twitter or Facebook that would raise reasonable suspicion, or somebody could just think that you're a potential terror threat, and then the nominators are encouraged not to dismiss such tips, and after evaluating the credibility of the source, could opt to nominate you to the list. Or somebody could be terrorish, maybe, but without any suspicion that they themselves are engaged in terrorist activity. Also, you could be, according to someone, you could be a little terrorish. That would be something that could possibly put you under as reasonable suspicion. But here's an interesting note. Individuals who are accused of being involved with a terrorist organization, but who are later acquitted in a court of law or saw those charges dropped, are still potential nominees for watch listing, so as long as reasonable suspicion has been established. So that's another way that that it seems that would justify the great expense that goes into being a targeted individual. I think I talked about it last time when we talked about some of the estimates for the neurological or the psychological warfare program. The statistics are that I'm familiar with is that it's estimated that for every 1,000 targeted individuals, that is $4 billion spent annually on targeting just 1,000. And for 250 targeted individuals, that's $1 billion every single year. For every single targeted individual, that comes down to $4 million per targeted individual per year, coming out of taxpayer money that was originally meant to go for the military, and then it's been funneled into one of these black ops, unacknowledged special access programs, which gives, and then if you're on the terror watch list, that gives the government permission to surveillance you, to monitor you, and then those funds that are extremely expensive are justified to being spent on targeted individuals each year. And also, when you look at the way that it's set up for targeted individuals, I don't think I talked about this last time. This is one of the things I wanted to share, was that the perpetrators are part of the global criminal cartel, and it can be broken down into 3 categories for the perpetrators. The primary perpetrators are handler teams, which are composed of operatives believed to be using classified technologies which enable remote monitoring, tracking, viewing, torturing, mind mining, dream inserting, electronic sleep depriving targeted individuals 24/7, operating outside the law with complete impunity. That's the primary handler teams. And then you have the organized stalkers at the street level, or also called contract group stalkers, cause stalkers, or gang stalkers, working at the street level as foot soldiers, following, leading, and harassing targeted individuals wherever they go out in public globally. And then there's a third set, unwitting perpetrators, believed to be mind-controlled ordinary citizens that harass targeted individuals on an unconscious level, unaware of their actions being remotely directed by their own set of handlers. And these handler teams, although they each target individuals, and also I talk about in the new book, there are different, there's estimated to be 170,000 targeted individuals, roughly estimated in the United States, and around 1 million worldwide. But of the 170,000, the highest level of targeting, because there's different levels of targeting. There is no good level of being a targeted individual, but when measured against that of another targeted individuals, there are different levels, and there are different amounts of money being spent on the research on different targeted individuals. My level in my research is the highest level. I'm what you call a signature target or a hard target. That's the 1% of the 1%. So if it's estimated that 1% of the global population of 7.5 billion people, 1% of that would be 75 million people. That large number may be people that have been implanted without their knowledge, permission, or consent. That may be the number of people that may be monitored and surveillance without their awareness, because that's happening too.
Right.
But the 170,000, those people know that they're being targeted, but there is a different level of different, and the 1% of the 1%, the level that I'm at would be 1% of 170,000 would be 1,700, which is not very many. So there's not too many people, at least in my research, that are at the high level of targeting.
Michael, I want to ask you, sorry to interrupt. I want to ask you, I think we talked about this last time you were on the show, but as you just mentioned, there is what you call implants that go along with the targeting. And I'm wondering if you can talk again a little bit about your implants and then also update us as to the status, because sometimes you get more implants, sometimes they change, etc. So do you want to address that as well?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, when the first time that I realized, well, it first started for me, in, I guess, December of 2001. I noticed I was getting organized stalking, and I knew something was unusual and odd in my life. But and then in January of 2008, I was actually drugged and abducted. And when I noticed all of these dozens of tiny little surgical incision scars that I had on my body, that's when I did all of the biomedical research with the MRIs. And I actually did, in my first book, I was actually able to have one of the implants removed from the inside of my lower gum line on my jaw. I had to go to about 10 or 12 different doctors until I finally found one. And each time I would go to the doctors, I would tell them, I have this little thing, I can feel it underneath my skin, and there's a scar there, and it's hurting me, and I'd like you to take it out. And every time I went to an ear, nose, or throat specialist, that's who you have to go to. That's the kind of doctor that would do the removal for you. They were all I could see that they were quite frightened of me, and they didn't want to get involved. And most of them would say, I went to about 10 or 12 different ones, and they said, and each one would send me to another, and they would say, I'm terribly sorry, we're not going to be able to help you with that. And they'd look at me for a couple of minutes, then they'd leave the room and go confer for about 10 or 15 minutes with some of their other partners in their medical practice. And then they'd come back. Sometimes even two of them would come back in the room, and one of them would do the speaking and just say, we're not going to be able to help you. We're terribly sorry. So they obviously knew that I was a targeted individual, and they'd been probably spoken to about not removing it. Anything that I wanted to have removed, they were probably told to not help me. But I did finally go to one doctor in North Carolina that agreed to remove it, and I was expecting the same being turned away again. But I was determined to. I figured if I kept going to enough people, eventually somebody would help me. And so this one doctor, I showed him what it was on the inside of my gum line. I could feel it. I showed it to him. He put on a glove and he could feel it. And he said, yeah, I'll take it out. And I said, and I hope that I'll be able to keep whatever you remove. He goes, yeah, sure. Whatever's in there, you can keep it. So that was the day that I went and met with him. But then when I came back a week later for the removal, he was a completely different person. I could tell that someone had spoken to him, that he'd been contacted.
Right.
And he just was not, he wasn't the same. He didn't have the same demeanor with me as being so friendly and so helpful the second time I went for the removal. And then when he actually did extract the implant, the foreign object, he wouldn't let me keep it and said he needed to send it to pathology. And it was sitting on the table, and he left the room for a second. He let me photograph it. I seriously considered swallowing it, because it was mine. But then I realized even if I recovered it, I wouldn't be able to get the validation that it needed, because it needs to be validated by a doctor that removes it, and then it never leaves their possession, their custody. But the chain of custody for something like that, whether it's a piece of glass or a pebble or a splinter or a shrapnel, anything that's not organic, that's being pulled out of a person, the chain of custody goes to that person. So I was only able to photograph this implant that I had removed. And I did.
What do you mean? What do you mean it goes to that person? In theory, it should go to you. Are you saying the person who removes it?
The person, me. It should go to the person that it's removed from.
Okay, but that's not the case, right?
Right, that didn't happen to me. They took it away from me. They sent it off to pathology, and then when I asked to get it back, they said that it had been destroyed. That pathology had determined that it was called. They called it a mucoid formation, and it wasn't. It was a perfect. It looked like a tiny. It was almost it almost looked exactly like maybe half the size of a Tic Tac, and about that color, kind of a white or an off-white color, and it was perfectly smooth and symmetrical.
Now, do you have the photograph on your website where people can see it or anything?
Yes, it's on my. I believe it's on the www.invisiblecrime.com. It should be on that website. There's a picture of it.
Okay.
Yeah, that one was taken. And then also I went to. I got referred by a very famous target individual who I think you've interviewed, who's written 2 books. That's a doctor. You may know him.
Okay. Do you remember the name or no?
Dr. John Hall.
Oh, well, yeah, he's the one who actually helps people that are targeted.
Right. Well, I got a referral to get one. I had another implant that I was aware of that I had ultrasounds of in my navel, and I was lucky to get a referral to a surgeon in San Antonio to have this removed. And it showed up. I had ultrasounds done in Madrid, Spain, and in London, England, and just maybe a month or 2 before, I went to San Antonio, Texas, and I got a referral for this surgeon there, and it cost me $8,000 out of my pocket, and they could feel it with their finger. You could feel it with the end of your finger in my navel, in my belly button. You could actually feel this, and there was a scar there. There was the same little white, tiny surgical incision scar, and you could feel it, and it showed up in ultrasounds. And then when I insisted on being awake for the surgery, and that's a really awful place to have a surgery, and they put up and I figured that way, at least if they took something out of me, at least I'd be awake. But they put up a sheet between me and the surgical site on my navel. And so I wasn't able to see what they were doing. And they had to put in 16 shots of lidocaine because I didn't want to have general anesthesia, because I didn't want to risk being re-implanted again. That would have been a perfect opportunity. But what happened was they didn't remove anything. And whereas before I had that surgery, I didn't have any pain in that area. But after that surgery, I had the familiar electronic pulsing, electronic harassment pain that so many target individuals that have been implanted know about, and the muscle twitching that goes along with having an implant. So that second surgery I had to pay for out of my own pocket, but it was really a surgery where nothing was done. They just opened me up and closed me, and may have most likely, what it seems, because I never had any pain there before, most likely it seems that they may have actually put something back inside me. So I came away from that one worse than if I hadn't had the surgery at all.
Okay, now where was that? Was that the one that happened to you in England or in Spain?
No, well, I mean, I got the confirmation that actual implant existed, and that was the first one that I had identified. When I went to Madrid, Spain, I knew a targeted individual in Spain, and that I'd been talking with over Skype for several months, and I told him I'd done all this research, and I said, you ought to check your navel to see if you have a scar there. And he looked and he said, I do. And I said, well, see if you can get an ultrasound of that, because he lived in Spain, and he went to a radiologist in his town, and he came back and he had a picture to show me on the internet. He said, look, I got this picture today, and it was a picture of the implant throwing off you could see the frequency, even in the ultrasound, you could see the frequency that was being thrown off of it. You could see this object that was clearly something that was not part of the human body. And so I actually flew over to, and I couldn't find a doctor over here that was willing to give me an ultrasound. And I couldn't just say, listen, I want an ultrasound of my navel. And then when I did have it, they would do ultrasounds of every area around it except the area that I wanted it done. And really making it difficult for me. So I got on a plane and I went over and visited this targeted individual in Spain. And within 2 hours of getting off the plane, I had my first medical evidence, which I included in my book. And the doctor just had a basic ultrasound machine. And with the wand, within 5 seconds after turning it on, he put the wand over my navel and he spoke a little English. He said, there it is. And you could see it on the screen. And he said, it's throwing off a frequency like it's alive.
Wow.
So
yeah,
I mean, you could actually see the frequency in the ultrasound. So I got pictures of that. And then I also got it. I also reestablished it by going to another doctor that I was hoping to get a removal from in England, in London, on Harley Street in London, where all the best doctors are. And I did get an ultrasound, which confirmed that same object was still there. And they described it as a very shiny object. It was about 0.5 millimeters, just underneath the surface of the skin. But that doctor, when I was contacting them through emails and through Skype, the doctor agreed to do the removal as long as I had the proof that there was something there. I had to discuss it. And also that was another thing, that you can't tell the doctor what you're having removed. You need to refer to it as a foreign object. Otherwise, you can't tell them, listen, I think I'm part of an unacknowledged special access program. I believe that I've been implanted by the government. They won't have anything to do with you.
Actually, they throw people in jail in England, right, and for that kind of thing.
Right. So in my first book, I described to the reader or any targeted individuals that are trying to get something removed, I tell them exactly how to go about doing that, because there's a right and wrong way. And you can still get an extraction. You can still have a removal done, but you need to refer to it as a foreign object. And that's what I did. And then once I got that proof, again, the doctor who had assured me that he was going to do a removal before, when I was living in North Carolina, before I flew to London, and then when I got there, and then before they did the surgery, he wanted to make sure, he wanted to do another ultrasound. So someone on his team did another ultrasound confirming it, but then he changed his mind and didn't want to do the removal. So,
really?
Yeah, the same thing happened to me. It's happened to a couple of different doctors that they, you can't command them. Sadly, even though a doctor, it's the same thing with lawyers. Technically they're working for you. You're the paying customer.
Right.
You're the client. But unlike other forms of where people would be, that you have to consult with people for different jobs, you can't command a lawyer to do anything. They have to take your case if they want to. You can't tell them listen, I want to sue this person. You can't tell them. You have to make them interested in your case in order to appeal to them, for them to even want to represent you. And it's the same relationship with the doctors. The lawyers and the doctors are really grouped together in that same category. You can't, even if you're right and you do have something that's underneath your skin that's bothering you, that's a foreign object that can be clearly seen in MRIs, in ultrasounds, or in X-rays, even so, you can't command a doctor to do that. If they don't want to, they don't have to. And also, if they've been warned not to, that's what usually happens to every doctor that I've gone to. They all seem to, if they aren't, they may be agreeable in the first meeting that I have with them, but then after the second meeting, or when I'm trying to set up a surgery, they often change their mind. And I say, well, but I can feel there's something right there. And he's like, well, I'm not going to go in there and dig around looking for something. I said, but you can see it in an ultrasound. And then, you end up getting into an argument with the doctor, with the surgeon, because it's frustrating, because they're obviously withholding on you. They're not helping you out, and they're trying to make things difficult for you. And they're also, as you said, they're looking for any excuse to lock you up, to incarcerate you, to put you into a psychiatric evaluation. Which that happened to me. That I talk about in my first book. That I don't think I shared that with you. In my first book, that's what happened to me. I didn't know when I was first drugged and abducted from my apartment in Hollywood the first time. When I woke up, I thought it was the next morning, but it was really 8 days later. I could tell that I'd been drugged. I had these scars on me I had all this missing time. I had bits and pieces that I remembered. And I still had whatever they drugged me with, which I later determined to be a drug called scopolamine, which is a very extremely fast-acting drug that virtually causes complete amnesia in the victim. I knew that whatever I had been drugged with was still in my system, and I spoke to private investigators, and they said, you need to be tested to prove that you've been drugged. So at first I started walking to the police station thinking, I'm going to tell the police, but then I realized when I get there, they're going to say, where's your proof? So I lived in Hollywood, right near Cedars-Sinai Hospital, only 2 blocks from my apartment. So I started walking to the emergency room, but I remembered what the private investigator had told me, that you need to, when they do a drug screening for any kind of date rape drugs or any kind of knockout drugs that would be used in a person, there are certain drugs that will come up, like Rohypnol would come up in a common screening. But for something as specific as scopolamine, you need to have a very expensive, specific test for that specific drug. Right. And I told the people at the emergency room, I made the mistake of telling them what had happened to me. I said, listen, I was in my apartment, I was drugged, I was abducted from my apartment, I still have this drug in my system, scopolamine. I need you to do a drug screening. I need to have a blood test and a specimen taken from me so that you can prove that what I'm saying is true, because otherwise people don't believe you. You say you've been drugged, but you need proof. Always they make you need evidence, you need proof. So I was determined. So I asked for that specific test, and I told them what had happened to me. And I was at that point very frustrated, and I hadn't really slept, and I'd been abducted for 8 days, and I was completely terrorized by this situation. And then the non-responsiveness from the medical team, just looking at me in disbelief. And when I told them all the things that were true that had happened to me, they didn't believe me, or they said that they didn't believe me. And they locked me up under medical evaluation originally for 72 hours. They held me against and here I was telling them the truth. And yet the truth that I'd been drugged and abducted was too fantastic for them, or they were just saying that it was, that's not possible. And then when I was in the psychiatric facility against being wrongfully detained there. It was so frustrating that I was there for, originally they were supposed to hold me for 72 hours and then release me, but they decided to hold on to me for 6 days until finally my sister called up and threatened to sue Cedars-Sinai.
Oh, wow.
And then within an hour they released me. But up until that 6th day when they released me,
incredible.
I mean, they would, every morning they would sit me down in front of a doctor. I would be sitting there in front of a doctor and a bunch of proteges that were working underneath him, taking notes. And he'd start asking me questions like, what happened to you? Why are you here, Mr. Bell? And I'd tell him, I'd say, listen, I was abducted from my apartment. I was drugged. And then, of course, you could see that the doctor was part of this because, I mean, when you're telling the truth and you hear someone say something like, now, why would somebody want to do something like that to you, Mr. Bell? Why? It just sounds absolutely ridiculous that somebody would come into your apartment, they would drug you, they would abduct you for 8 days and hold you, and then return you to your apartment. It just doesn't sound reasonable. Now, why would somebody want to do that? You know, and then, of course, that was very frustrating for me to have to, and then each day they would do that same thing. They'd sit me down and ask me why I was here, and I was being wrongfully detained. And finally, I was released. And then later, they tried to charge me $20,000 for that 6 days that I had to fight for 2 years until they finally dropped it. The charges for me to pay them $20,000. But then also after that, that was the first time that I was locked up. Within 6 months of that first time, 2 more times that I got locked up. And one of the times I was, as I described in my first book, I was driving on Wilshire Boulevard, and I was at a stoplight, or I was stopped on Wilshire Boulevard very early, about 4 o'clock in the morning, 4:30 in the morning. I was going to the gym that I would go to that opened up about 4:45 or 5 o'clock in the morning, because I would go and work out in the morning, and then I'd be done about 7 a.m. And by that time I was done, all the people in Los Angeles, which is very busy, as you probably know, in the gyms, they get really crowded.
Yes.
So you have to go early. Mm-hmm. So I was on the way to the gym one morning, and somebody pulled up alongside my car and threw a cinder block that was wrapped up in plastic against my window, the passenger window.
Wow.
And sprayed, and somebody got out of the van and sprayed something into the car, which I don't know what it was, but all of my airbags went off, and I was terrified. And so I just got on the freeway, and I drove for about 15 or 20 minutes, and I ended up being in Torrance, California, and I was under the influence of whatever they'd sprayed at me, and I pulled over into a 7-Eleven, and a police car happened to be coming by and noticed that the 2 passenger side windows were blown out and the airbags were popped. And I was just sitting there in the parking lot under the influence of whatever they'd sprayed at me. But yet I was, whatever they'd given me wasn't like any kind of, I believe it was the scopolamine again, because even under the scopolamine, it doesn't, the person who's underneath the influence of that very powerful, quick acting drug can seem completely rational and normal, and you wouldn't know that they're under the influence of anything. They just won't remember that afterwards. In Colombia, where scopolamine is very popular, used for robbery, and primarily robbery and sexual assault, people who have been given scopolamine by their perpetrators can be told to go into the bank and withdraw all of their money in cash, and the person that they have to deal with, the perpetrators, will be waiting outside. This is a very popular thing that happens in Colombia and in Ecuador, where the drug is manufactured, and where it originally comes from. And the person will go into the bank and be under the influence of this scopolamine, and which can actually just be on a piece of paper, and a person can come up to you and just blow it into your face, and you'd be instantly. I mean, it literally takes less than a minute for the drug's full effects to kick in, and so a person could be directed by the perpetrators to go into the bank, withdraw all of their money, and then take all that money and come out of the bank and give it to the perpetrators and not remember any of it. And then later see themselves on video camera. And then when the person that they had to deal with in the bank, that they were withdraw, because you can't just withdraw, you have to go explain to someone. The person who they had to deal with couldn't tell that they were under the influence of anything. They seemed like they were perfectly normal, because if you want to, you can just go into a bank and say, listen, I want all my money in cash right now. But that's usually kind of suspicious, so they kind of put up a little bit of a fight. But with this scopolamine, it's so fast acting. But again, that's what happened to me the second time. So the police that saw me in my car took me in for observation. And when they took me in for observation, I told them what had happened to me, that someone had thrown something at my car and somebody had sprayed something at me. And there I was again locked up again in psychiatric center, and with people who, when I was there was about 30 other people in this unit. And in the first one too, they were all about the same size. I went to 3 different ones within a 6-month period that I said the wrong thing that allowed them to grab me and lock me up. And when I was there, I could see that the people who were there were seriously disturbed people. And even the people that were there would say to me, what are you doing here? Why are you here? I said, I don't know. Somebody threw something at my car and sprayed something at me, and now I'm here. And they're like, why would you? And again, the doctors would say to me, why would somebody do something like that to you? I don't know. I don't. And at that point, I didn't know that I was being. I didn't know what a targeted individual was.
I appreciate, Michael, just want to slow you down there a little bit and appreciate that. I'd like to ask you a couple things, if you don't mind, because, it's good information, and I think it's important that people hear this kind of thing can go on. I do think that there is a level at which you end up being sort of attracting a targeting, not only after being targeted, but continue to attract it also because of your mental state. Now, I'm wondering whether or not you have basically been able to tap into what's going on with you. And you mentioned the super soldier side of things, and the experimental side of it. And it does seem that you are sort of picked out because of certain things. Now, I would say there's a bloodline relationship here, and I don't know how much investigation you've done on your family's bloodline, beyond the fact that you ended up, colliding with that Rothschild, etc., or a relation of the Rothschilds. So what I'm trying to say here is it does appear, also from your physicality, that you're being experimented on multiple ways in which you may not have even tapped into quite yet. And I'm just wondering, have you thought about the bloodline connection, and can you talk about your family history at all in that relation?
Well, both of my parents originally go back. My ancestry goes back to England, both of my families.
Right.
And I still have cousins over in England. But I don't really know. I don't know specifically. It hasn't been made aware, or at least I haven't uncovered how my bloodline is connected. But certainly, I'm sure that it has something to do with it.
It does. And because of the research I do, I would encourage you to start looking down that road. Now, There is a woman, I don't know if I've mentioned her to you before, but that I've interviewed. I interviewed her, I believe, and I also have had her speak at my conferences. She took a year off, so she didn't appear this year, but her name is Kathy Morgan. Have you become aware of her? She's English, and she has been doing an incredible amount of work investigating her own family line, her bloodline, and the sort of targeting of her and her family, and the sort of experimentation being done on them.
Right.
And there have been, periods of time when they've been questioned as part of surveys and all kinds of things. And then she's also done this whole tracking of bloodlines and the relationship between certain individuals and what happens to them, and also the Illuminati members that are affiliated with them, and so on. So what I think you need to do, in my opinion, in order to get to the bottom of this in your case, your name is very significant, and I'm sure you didn't have to tell me you had an English link up. I could tell that, of course. Now, is Fitzhugh Bell, is that on your mother's side, or is that your father's side, or is that, how did that come about?
It's Fitzhugh is my mother's, was my mother's last name before my mother's parents' last name was Fitzhugh. It's
right.
On my mother's
so
side.
It's her maiden name. It's called her maiden name. All right.
Mary Peabody Fitzhugh. That's my mother's maiden name.
Right. So she's an Illuminati. You're from what we call an Illuminati bloodline. Now, Bell is also, I guess you're maybe familiar with Fred Bell. I don't know if you know who Fred Bell was, a very famous scientist who worked in black projects. He also worked as a hitman, as it happened, for a time. Sean David Morton knew him very, very well. He unfortunately died. He's working on time travel, etc. But Bell is also quite a significant name in the whole sort of black project Illuminati trajectory. So what happens is, this is going to be the real reason that you're chosen, if you will, even beyond, as I'm saying, if you want to delve deeper and you want to find out what's really going on, you've got to look into your bloodline, because this is why you were chosen. You could have hit the guy and maybe they would do payback, but they would have left you, alone. But because of who you are, that's a whole different ballgame. So what I suggest is that you start going down that road, and even get in touch with Kathy Morgan if you want to find out more about what they do in England. But, England is, in my opinion, is even worse in terms of how they target people and have been, they're like experts at this. Some of this stuff came over with Tavistock, as you may know. And then here in the West Coast, think tank is, it's going to escape my name here. The words I don't remember the name, I'll get it. But anyway, there's a think tank over here on the West Coast. There's also ones in the East Coast as well, having to do with mind control and doing various things. So it's just that I'm saying that this is a maybe unexplored area, and this is something that everyone who is targeted needs to really look into, because it may seem insignificant to you or me, but I can assure you it's not to the perpetrators, that are part of this, and why they're using you specifically to experiment upon.
Right. Well, I hope I can. I have something I don't think I talked about this last time. I wanted to, if I could, share quickly a little bit about the handler teams.
Right. Go ahead.
That work. The handler teams that are they're teams that are composed of operatives believed to be using the classified technology, which enables them to remote view, to track, view, torture, dream insertion, electronic sleep deprivation, all of those things that happen to targeted individuals. When those things happen, those are coming from their handler teams. And in my research, the handler teams are believed to be, and also handler teams can handle up to several dozen targeted individuals. So it's not just like there may be some groups that are just for one person, but usually in my research, from what the private investigators, from what the former CIA agent shared with me, that these handler teams are able to work many different targeted individuals simultaneously. And these handler teams are believed to be composed of a minimum of 4 people working in 12-hour shifts with 2 people posted each shift. Some handler teams will have as many as 6 to 8 members working in 6 to 8-hour shifts with 2 people posted at each shift, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Each team will most likely have a computer specialist, as the manipulation of the targeted individual's computer and email are a crucial part of the mind control process. Each team will also likely have a psychologist, as well as an electronics specialist for phone tapping and manipulation of the electrical grid of the targeted individual's residence. And the handler teams are reportedly deluded into thinking that the ongoing human experimentation tests that they're conducting are for reasons other than that of military research. It's unlikely the perpetrators will ever come forward to reveal their operations, as it's highly illegal and breaks dozens of laws. Perhaps the conscience of at least one of these basically good people will drive them to expose this cruel and inhumane crime against humanity. So that's the handler teams. That's where a lot of the resources are chewed up for targeted individuals, and people, people will say, when you tell people, like, do you know how much something like that would cost? Yes. And this program that I'm a part of, since its inception, since the end of World War II with Operation Paperclip, where all the scientists from the Nazi scientists from Germany that were working on human experimentation were rounded up and basically brought to the United States and continued their ongoing research with the United States. And then over the years, for the people that don't know that this human experimentation is real, you have things that came up over the years, like MK Ultra, which was a real mind control, CIA mind control project, right, that supposedly ended in the 70s, but really,
no, it's just been expanded since then.
Yeah, it's only expanded and gone deeper underground. But also, I don't know if I shared this last time. There was one other thing that some of the reasons that targeted, besides the bloodline and some of the other reasons that I may not be fully aware of, some of the reasons that target individuals are believed to being exploited for include some of the following: medical testing to see if certain types of cancer can be caused or mutated simply through the power of suggestion. That's one test that's being believed to be being tested on some targeted individuals. Also, various unknown mind control experiments that are classified and unknown. Obviously, ritualistic torture and sadistic gratification factors into some of this torturing of targeted individuals, and also psychological and physical experimentation, as well as human trafficking, certainly on some level. And as you touched on earlier, perverse forms of entertainment and voyeurism, perhaps people in the entertainment business would be targets for that specifically. And also another one that was very interesting that I don't know if other targeted individuals have shared with you. This is one that's done. This is a test that's been done to a lot of targeted individuals that I've talked to. It's to see if the sexual orientation of a person can be changed from heterosexual to homosexual, from homosexual to heterosexual. To see if those basic orientation of a person can be changed. And I'm a straight man. I like women, but I've noticed over the years, in some, especially in the dream manipulation of my targeting, that certainly the perpetrators were trying to. I would have unnatural thoughts that were not my own, products of my own imagination, that were being forced on me. And it wasn't until later that I understood what was happening to me that I was able to determine that obviously it's some kind of a test that's being conducted on me to see if that can be done. And also to see for any of these tests that are being done to target individuals, one of the things is to determine which techniques and methods get the best results. How long does it take a targeted individual to capitulate to a new technique or a new method? These are all things that are being collected, the information and the data being collected on targeted individuals. And also to have targeted individuals to see if they can be made to believe absurd things that don't happen or don't exist. An example would be the US intelligence community convinced a young Muslim at Guantanamo Bay that he'd lost his hands and legs, even though he had not lost them. They convinced him through mind control that he had. And that was one of the experiments of this program, the same techniques and same methods that are being perpetrated on innocent American targeted individuals like myself. And also, another one of the tests or of the projects is to determine if targeted individuals can be influenced to commit treason or assassinate political figures, right, and not remember it. Something like the Manchurian Candidate, like that story.
Yes, of course.
And also to see if targeted individuals can be made to think about dishonest actions when they are really perfectly honest people. So these are some of the tests that I know that are being conducted amongst other things. And of course, new things are coming in all the time. And
okay, now, Michael, I want to ask you before, sure, we've been going for a while. I want to make sure to ask you this question before I forget it. I'm sorry to again interrupt, but
no, that's fine.
I want to know whether or not you have tried to be regressed at all.
Oh, through hypnosis?
Yes.
I haven't tried that, but I'm sure that would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, I think that's, obvious. I mean, it's kind of like an understatement to say that would be really, really required in your case. Although I can understand where you would have trouble trusting somebody to do so.
And again, you if you say the wrong thing to the wrong psychological person, the wrong psychologist or psychiatrist, sure, you could be locked up again. So you have to be very
but there's going to be a lot more, leeway. Now, there are people specifically, I wouldn't go to the establishment. I would go to an alternative, therapist, a person who does do regressions in that way. And I also want to bring another interview I've done. Her name is Solaris Blue Raven. I don't know if you've ever dealt with her. She has quite a sophisticated dealings with this kind of targeting, working through, I believe she believes it's actually working through the quantum level at this point. And I did do an interview quite a long time ago with her, but it's an excellent interview for those that are interested. She also spoke at the Super Soldier Summit. Have you tried to, or have you been involved in any of the Super Soldier or mind control conferences that Lori, I forget her last name, Lori puts on?
I haven't actually been to one of those conferences, but I was going to say, I believe that that's one of the programs that I'm being tested for, the super soldier / transhumanism
Right.
program. And some of the things that have happened to me as a result of that specific testing, that can be attributed. And this is one of the things that I specifically got from the former CIA agent. I explained to them some of the things that had happened to me, and this person told me that it sounded like, from what I shared with him, that I was probably in the super soldier transhumanism program. And what had happened to me is that sometimes some of the psychological testing that's being done on me and people like me that are in this type of testing, one of the things is that you can go for, even if you don't want to, you have the capability sometimes against your will of being up for several days in a row without needing sleep. And then, of course, at the end of several days, you're going to be very tired. But the same thing can happen with physical activity. You can be given, if you're running or doing exercise, you can be given this psychological subconscious incentive that's appealing to somewhere on your subconscious that allows you to keep going and not get tired. And also the same thing happens with the mental acuity. If you ever saw the movie Limitless with Bradley Cooper,
Right.
and the fictitious drug that they spoke of in that movie called NZT-48, that drug in that movie gave the person who took it, the user of that drug, very highly focused, extremely focused mental acuity. And sometimes I've actually experienced that from time to time. That will happen to me. That it happened to me at several points when I was writing the second book, The Invisible Crime Part 2, several points. And when that happened to me, it was much like it was depicted in the movie. I felt like I understood everything. I felt like I could see my life and everything very clearly focused, with a mental acuity that I wouldn't normally have. It wouldn't be part of my normal natural abilities. I could tell that this was being imposed on me, but it made my senses so much more heightened, and my mental acuity was so strong that I was able to think 3 or 4 or 5 moves ahead of where I would normally think, and my normal perception. And I don't know if you've heard of other people that have experienced this, but it does happen to me from time to time.
Well, actually, I do experience this. I mean, it can happen naturally through what you call a Kundalini activation. And so you can look into that. Yogis have talked about this for ages. So it does happen. And I've known other individuals who also experience it, as do I from time to time. It's, it's not a bad thing. Now, I don't know whether or not in your case there is another component to it, but, it might be worth investigating. So just in terms of where things are going now, right, and what your plans are, actually, I'd be interested to know what are your plans for the future, and do you ever talk out, like do lectures as part of conferences on mind control, etc.?
I haven't, but I'd like to. I'm obviously always going to be. I mean, I have 2 books out right now, and my second book just came out in September of last year, so less than a year ago. But I'll certainly, probably, most likely be working on a 3rd book for sure. I haven't done any public speaking before, really, outside of any of my interviews that I did through any of the shows that I've been lucky enough to appear on, radio shows or this show. Outside of that, I've really not done any public speaking. And actually, it's unusual for me because when I was growing up, it's actually one of the most popular and the most common phobia is actually public speaking. That was something that I really suffered from when I was growing up, especially in college, getting up in front of a large group of people and speaking. And then I thought to myself, you know, once I'm done with college, I'll never have to do that again. And then, you know, and then I became a targeted individual, and I realized that the only way that I was going to be able to reach anyone was to do interviews, something that I'd always found very difficult and hard to do, and was a real phobia for me. You know, other people have fear of heights or fear of insects or deep water or death, but actually public speaking is the #1 phobia for people. People would rather die than speak in front of a large group of people, it seems, at least according to the statistics. But so now it's something that I will never be able to escape. I will have to confront it directly and try to become a better speaker and more interesting.
I think you do a great job, so I wouldn't worry about it at all at this point in your life. You know, you handle yourself very well. So at this moment, just in terms of, you know, wrapping this up, I do want to ask, we do have a chat room alongside here. And so what I want to do is, and try to do it towards the end of a show, is ask the people in the chat room to type questions that they might like to have you answer. And then I can go through the questions. So if the chat room would, if the people in there would type in preferably all caps, just so I can distinguish between the rest of the dialogue. Questions for Michael while we still have him here. You're welcome to do so. You know, I'm sure people are finding that out about themselves as well. Another thing that I did want to ask you has to do with what is in essence electronic targeting of sites, because I do conferences and sometimes I organize them myself as well. And regardless of whether I'm attending and speaking or organizing and speaking, the conferences are always targeted heavily by electromagnetic of all kinds. And people do get ill from it. I get ill from it. Happens to me every time I do a conference. And we had very heavy electronic and we also had black helicopters flying over us at my Awake and Aware in England. So that often accompanies a targeting in terms of a lot of people will talk about that and various other things. So I'm wondering if you're aware of this, of the electromagnetic EMF waves and other kinds of targeting that happens to venues. Because I'm also hearing that people at various well-known conferences that I don't attend, but are about subjects that have to do with things we're talking about here, mind control, targeting, and also the whole UFO sector, secret space program, etc. A lot of those people will also complain of the targeting and experience that. And I'm very aware of it on my part. So are you aware of that? And have you looked into that, talked to people about it?
So you brought that up because I was going to say that during my radio interviews, no matter how much I prep, no matter how many notes and stuff I have, I've noticed this, that since I did my first interview in 2012, I think, during my radio interviews, I believe my perpetrators are using a similar frequency or signal weapons on me, trying to diminish my ability to communicate effectively to the listeners, jamming and dulling my focus, disorienting me as I try to form and convey thoughts, even sometimes mid-sentence, which completely compromises my credibility. Sometimes I'll just be, forget exactly what I was talking about, just like that. I mean, that was an example, but a lot of times that would happen to me during my interviews.
Sure.
I would have somebody ask me something, and I'd start giving the answer, and I'd draw a complete blank. And sometimes that can happen to people, but I noticed that it would never happen in my ordinary everyday life, but it would happen on these shows where I was trying to reach an audience and appeal to people in a way that they can understand and do it credibly so that they can believe what I'm telling them. And then when I stop in the middle of what I'm talking about and don't finish it, it really damages your credibility, and you lose people's attention and their interest when they're listening. So that's definitely happens to me every time I do an interview like this one. So I can only imagine for you when you do your conferences, it must be even greater, and especially with the added pressure of being live up in front of people. And I'm sure that, as they often do, will make it difficult for your electronics or your microphones or any of those things. I'm sure you may have experienced those kind of electrical disturbances.
Well, that's an understatement. Camelot, Project Camelot experiences this sort of thing, and people actually blame us for it when 99% of the time it's actually not us. So, and that's not to say we're electronics or audio experts, but we can't be responsible for what happens at the other end of the video, so to speak, at the side of the person that I interview, but there can be incredible interference. In fact, sometimes YouTube, which is this massive organization with gigantic servers, has actually refused to work at all. That's been a recent thing. And that happens to me when we talk to Simon Parks, for example. And at my conference, Simon was, again, targeted in the throat chakra, where I was targeted when I was interviewing him prior to that. And this kind of thing goes on. So there is multiple kinds of targeting going on. But I do think it's important for people who attend conferences to understand that if they do find that they start getting headaches, if they start experiencing in my case, it gets freezing cold all around me. I'll notice that, the change in temperature, which is inexplicable. And there'll be other things that go on having to do with feeling ill and so on. And I've actually had experience where I drive outside the perimeter of a conference, just, like a mile or something. And suddenly I'm fine. All the effects are gone and I'm fine. That's how come I know that this is real. And it happens every time. And I've been doing conferences for many, many years now, since the beginning of Camelot. So this kind of thing does go on, as well as, yes, attacking both sides of the spectrum. In other words, the talk show host or whatever, as well as their guest. So that goes on as well. And I think people are aware of that.
I was going to say, when you said that, it reminded me of something. When at one of my apartments in Palm Springs, I used to get, you may have experienced this, maybe what you were describing. I used to get in my apartment, and even as I approached my apartment, when you said when you were driving the perimeter, when I would approach, sometimes in my apartment, I would get hit with something called the sonic nausea device. It's a device that causes you to be nauseous, and that was really making me lose a lot of weight at one of my apartments. And I noticed when I drove away from the apartment, I felt okay. And, I'd forget about it when I drove away.
Right.
When I was doing shopping and out and about and doing things. But then as soon as I pulled into my street, I would just feel this gag. I could feel that when I came into the perimeter of this frequency that was saturating my apartment there. I could feel it as soon as I came around the corner and drove into my street. Even before I got to my apartment building, I could feel, so maybe that kind of, you may have experienced, that may have been what you were talking about, but yes.
Right.
Yeah, I called it the sonic nausea device, because that's something that they have actually used on crowd control. It's a frequency that they use on, in conjunction with water cannons and things like that to control large crowds of people that are putting on demonstrations and causing a real problem.
Right.
They can use that. They can use that device on them. So.
Okay,
Yeah,
now I have some other questions that are coming up in the chat, so I wanted to run those by you quickly. Someone wants to know if you have any type of personality markers that indicate genetic alteration. Not sure how you would know that, but do you have an answer for that question?
If I have any genetic markers, I don't know about that. You mean that would make me a target, that something that would appeal to the criminal group?
Well, I think the way it's worded is they call it personality markers that indicate genetic alteration. I'm not sure what they mean by personality marker indicating genetic alteration, other than something that is keyed into your genetics, and in other words, something that you don't have control over that came with your genetics. I don't know. Maybe he means things like stuttering, or things where people have some kind of genetic issue. I'd have to ask that person to perhaps
maybe it could
explain.
be something good, like
Sure.
Memory skills.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, the person is asking the question. I don't know
I know that I have, which makes me think that, I don't know how long that I've been in this program. So I've been aware of it since